Which players will be the most improved for the Dallas Cowboys during the 2024 season? All that and more in this episode of the Locked On Cowboys podcast.
You are Locked On Cowboys, your daily Dallas Cowboys podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. We'd like to thank you for making us your first listen of the day. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I admit it, I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile hit twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go, now free on the App Store or Google Play. I am your host, Marcus Mosher. You can follow me on Twitter at Marcus_Mosher. Joining me today, as always, is Landon McCool. You can follow him on Twitter at McCoolBCB. On today's show, we're going to be discussing a recent tidbit of information, thanks to our friend Wanye Thomas, about the most improved players so far this offseason for the Dallas Cowboys. He actually named 4 players. We're going to talk about the top 3. And let's start with second-year linebacker Demarvion Overshown, who we were really excited about last year in the preseason until he got hurt. What is your take on maybe Overshown making a big leap here in year 2?
Well, first off, it was great to kind of just get a check-in from Wanye Thomas. He took a moment off of the Met Gala red carpet to give us some names. No, of course, he was on the Brock Hoffman podcast, and they asked him about some improved players. And I think that the name that kind of rolled off his tongue immediately as the first guy that was like the obviously Demo is what he said. And I have to be honest, it took me a second to kind of reverse engineer in my brain who Demo was and who he was referring
Not
to.
DeMarco Murray, but
No, not DeMarco Murray. And I was glad that it wasn't DeMarco Murray because he's, I don't think he's going to be playing the league much longer now that he is. But Demarvion Overshown, and I think that actually lines up a lot with what we've been hearing and what we've been seeing in pictures at times. If you've seen a picture of Demarvion this off season, or I think that there was some. What did they had some like off season workout stuff, but they released
OTAs.
Pictures. Oh, that's right. The first section of OTAs. He looks different. Like he looks huge, especially compared to where he was. If you saw him last year, he had a very kind of similar build to Jaron Kearse kind of, where like he was an undersized linebacker, very long, lengthy kind of guy. Overshown was only ever a linebacker, but he definitely was built similar to Kearse. So the word on the street is that he's also not only gotten huge and gained a ton of weight while obviously rehabbing from an ACL injury, but also that he's been in there every single day and he's worked incredibly hard. So certainly need a Demarvion Overshown leap. Like I think that would be a huge benefit to a team that we've talked about, has some numbers at linebacker, has a couple of guys that you feel like can, obviously more than fit the role as you needed. But if you're looking for someone to kind of step up as a star from this group, right, as someone who could, make a surprise leap and be a bright benefit, a bright star, a guy that you didn't see coming out of nowhere. I think that Overshown is that guy. There was so much hype surrounding him in training camp. I went and watched the Jacksonville preseason game again last night, and he was all over it. And I just think the opportunity to kind of, well, it's a lost season. I'm still going to get my body right in the best way I can until I can rehab the leg. He clearly has rebuilt himself, and he's ready to really take advantage of his opportunity coming up in this next season.
So my next question for you is: we never got to see him in Dan Quinn's defense, but how do you think his game is going to translate to a Mike Zimmer defense?
I mean, I think it'll translate fine. Because I do think that, as a run and hit linebackers are going to be useful in almost any spot, right? It's just about how they get deployed and how they get used. And I think that, I think what you're going to see is Overshown kind of taking early on a kind of, backup role to Damone Clark, right? And seeing, I think that likely we'll see Clark switch back to his more natural will linebacker spot. And then we'll see Overshown and Clark kind of, take the turns to see who went out in training camp for that spot. I think that, there's still plenty of room for these types of linebackers in Zimmer's defense. They're still going to be useful. There's still going to be times when you're running nickel defenses or you want speed on the second level, or you're going to emphasize it. And I think that he's going to be an incredibly valuable piece there. And maybe, also with the added weight that he's put on, specifically in his shoulders and his arms, based on what I've seen, maybe that helps him kind of take on blockers a little bit. And that helps him, have more opportunities to get on the field in the Zimmer defense.
I'm really excited about him because, man, the speed that he played at, and I know, listen, it's the preseason, so we can't overreact to the preseason too much, but he was flying on the field and he seemed confident. He was making every tackle. And I think what you're going to see right away is the coverage ability. Like in this Mike Zimmer defense, it's not only about being able to stop the run, like those inside linebackers have to fly down the middle of the field in coverage, right?
Yeah.
And I almost can't think of a more perfect fit for Overshown than a Mike Zimmer defense, because yes, the going the sideline to sideline is important, but can you pedal backwards and drop into zones? I mean, he's a former safety, remember? Like, I do think this is a really good fit for him. And if you're watching with us on YouTube right now, you can see the numbers coming out of college. He was 229 pounds. I got to imagine. I mean, I've seen some recent pictures and he's easily in the upper 230s, if not low 240s. Again, I'm really excited. I think I wouldn't be surprised if he's one of the players that goes from a borderline starter to, this is an impact defender for the Cowboys.
Yes.
This is one of their 5 or 6 most important defenders.
Yeah, I mean, I think even last year, I mean, look, you're right. It's hard to understand exactly sometimes what you're seeing in training camp or in preseason is how that will project into the NFL. But I think one of the things that you can see is just the speed that he had relative to the other players on the field and the ability he had to, while playing with the first, I think it's always impressive when you get young players getting their opportunities with the ones for the first time, and they're the ones who are making the plays, right? Suddenly they step in with the first team and they are still who they are, despite playing with the higher level of competition. That's when you start to kind of get excited with the players that you see. And that's what was happening with Overshown, is that he was starting to get, at the end of training camp, you're starting to see him get rotated in with the first team. You started to see him with that group. And while he was on the field, he was the guy who was making the tackles. He was the guy who was mixing it up. So that's a good sign. That's a sign that he belonged then. And that was a year ago. So now another year of kind of just, look, it's not the same. It's not the same as going through an offseason healthy at all. Obviously, a good portion of it is going through rehab and dealing with all that. But Overshown, from what we know, and part of the reason that they drafted him is his work ethic, his love of the game. And so a guy like that is going to squeeze the water out of every stone, right? He is going to obviously spend all that time. He can't work out his lower body, working out his upper body. He's going to, be in the weight room and digesting Zimmer's playbook now. And I think that was another thing that Wanye mentioned, is that they spent a lot of time kind of really digging deep into that playbook to make sure they understood and they could hit the ground running when OTAs and training camp started. So, yeah, I definitely think that Overshown is one of a couple of these players who, have just kind of we've lost a touch with for a little bit, because, we had to set them aside. Now that the draft is over and now that we're getting back into OTAs, it's time to start kind of remembering who some of these folks are and what their impact could be in the upcoming season.
All right, let's talk about a couple other defenders that Wanye Thomas mentioned that have really impressed him this offseason. We will get to that next. This episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. All right, game off. We got to pause here to talk more about Monopoly Go. And I know what you're saying. Marcus, you've talked about this over and over again, but there's just so much good stuff in this game that I've got to tell you more. In Monopoly Go, you can team up with friends for time tournaments where you work together to build up each other's boards. The more that you win together, the more awesome prizes that you unlock. And there's so much awesome things to get, like unique stickers that you can trade with your friends to complete albums for big prizes, cool new playing pieces that you can travel the boards with, and hilarious emojis for taunting your friends when you smash their buildings and heist their vaults. Plus, Monopoly Go feels new and exciting every day with constantly changing tournaments and challenges. A ton of them include their own unique mini games And there's always new timed events that help you win big, like massive multipliers for everything you win or rent frenzies. There's always something fun to discover in Monopoly Go. So get off the bench and go download it now for free on Google Play or the App Store. Game on. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. Are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV all day? Are you having to turn down the volume because of all that shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today, a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all that screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't miss analysis, opinions, and news, streaming 24/7 on YouTube or on the free Amazon Fire TV channels app, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day. All right, let's get to Junior Fehoko, a day 3 defensive lineman who really did not play at all. He played basically as much as Overshown did last year. He just isn't coming off a major injury. What are your thoughts on him maybe making a leap here in year 2?
Well, I got to say, when I think it was, a week or two after Zimmer got signed, and I think, one of the initial questions that we had talked about was who was the player that was going to be, on the roster currently that was going to be most positively influenced by the switch, right? And I think, we had answered at the time DeMarcus Lawrence, because of obviously the fit there. But to me, in my brain, the name that first popped into my head was Fehoko, because I just feel like this is the kind of guy that he could play on the outside in the Zim defense. He's a bigger guy. Like there's this kind of misconception because we look at the mock draftable numbers that he's a, he's listed at 276. He didn't play at 276.
No.
Well, I watched an interview with him at Cowboys rookie mini camp from last year. And at that point, at minicamp, he was 282, he said, and that he was hoping to gain upwards of 10 pounds before going into training camp. So this is a guy whose playing weight is actually probably closer to 285, right? And to me, 6'3", 285, 6'3", 290, and let's go ahead and be generous, right? And say he had a great offseason. Obviously, that's why we're talking about him. I'm going to say that there's a good chance that he gained, let's say, 10 to 12 pounds of permanent muscle, right? So let's say he's actually at 288, in rock solid, right? I think there's a good chance that you're going to see him continue to slide inside as a 3 technique, especially on passing downs. He will become kind of that true inside-outside guy, and maybe even just kind of fully transitioning to 3 technique at some point as potentially your backup, to Odigizua. I'm excited about this guy because, it's not even just his physical stature that kind of matches up with the Zimmer play style. He is relentless. He and his motor runs just really high all the time, and he's just constantly in pursuit. And I think that's the kind of thing that Zimmer really, has a affinity for. So I have, huge hopes for what Junior can do. He didn't do much last year. We saw a little bit of him there. I think we saw enough last year that we were like intrigued, but it felt like it was like barely controlled chaos with him, right? And so I'm hoping that this offseason was a lot of technique work because he's violent, he's explosive, he has all those traits. I think if anything, it just needs to be honed a little bit in his technique. But I'm excited to see what he puts on the field next year because I do think that he could be a guy that, again, much like Demarvion, could really surprise us with what he has for us in store for us next year.
I'm also curious to see where Mike Zimmer plays him because we've seen, like, if you go back to his days with the Bengals, like in the early 2010s, when they had some big defensive ends, whether it was like Carlos Dunlap or I think was it Frosty Rucker or Robert Gathers was one of their guys. Like they have no problem at all, like on base downs, playing a 285-pound edge to help you stop the run. I don't think Fehoko is going to live as an edge defender in the NFL, but I do think like if in certain packages, it makes sense to have DeMarcus Lawrence and Fehoko, and then you have Micah Parsons lined up over the center, and that's how you create pressure. So I think that's the thing I'm most interested to see is like Where does he line up? We've also heard some reports from some friends of ours that sounds like he's doing really well in some of his personal training and getting ready for the season. I'm really excited because this is somebody who the Cowboys clearly thought a lot of, and I think they drafted him last year with the idea of probably going to be a game day inactive, but we know we're going to lose a couple of defensive linemen in free agency. Let's get him into the system year 2. That's when he'll be able to step up and make plays for us.
Yeah, and again, to kind of even broaden out the scope of the situation, it'll be interesting to see where how they use him in conjunction with Chauncey Golston too,
I would
right?
agree.
Because I think both of those guys are kind of it fits for sort of the ability to kind of move up and down the line as needed. They're different players though; they're different
They're
body
very
styles.
different. Yeah.
Yeah, and even Fehoko is different than kind of some of the the more prototypical bigger defensive ends that Zim uses. Like Carlos Dunlap was a long defender. He was big, but he was a 6'6", like stretched out dude, whereas Fehoko is 6'2" and some change, right? So, but I still think the point applies. I think he will play some strong base end at times while rushing the passer inside on passing downs. I think that, this is a guy that, especially in conjunction with how they're going to use Golston, this is one of my biggest questions about the Zimmer defense that I can't wait to solve when twin training camp comes is how are they using some of these bigger bodied defensive ends that obviously can reduce down? Are they, is it just based on passing lines? Are they going to use them more as defensive ends than the previous administration? Those are all things that I'm excited to figure out once we get into OTAs and training camp.
The Cowboys have to have one of these rotational defensive linemen step up. I mean, we know the starters.
Yep.
I would assume that Sam Williams and Marshawn Nealon are going to play quite a bit.
Yeah.
But you need one of these other players, whether it's Chauncey Golston, whether it's Fehoko, maybe it's Carl Davis, who the Cowboys re-signed this offseason. Like, they have to have one of these players step up. And probably Fehoko is the one that I'm the most intrigued with just because he is so young. He does have a very interesting body type, and he was so doggone productive at San Jose State.
Yeah.
Like, I just want to see how it looks. Like, we really didn't get to see him at all last year. So it's almost, I hate when people say this. It's like adding another draft pick, but it kind of is. Like, it's just another interesting prospect who we really didn't get an opportunity to see.
I mean, I have to think. I was thinking about this last night. The Cowboys have more of the type of player that you just described, I think, this season than it feels like any other season I can remember, right? Of these guys that we were really excited about in training camp that because of injury, because of roster machinations or whatever, got a red shirt last year or didn't basically get
more red shirts than ever.
Yeah, and it just feels like we're having and honestly, I think that that's part of like the gap between the Cowboys fandom feeling about this team and the front office feeling about this team, and not that either one of them is more correct than the other, but I think that that's part of it, right? Is that the Cowboys front office looks at guys like Junior Fehoko and see what they've done in the offseason, Demarvion Overshown, see what they've done in the offseason, and then they poo-poo the idea that they need to go sign a veteran guy because they want to see these guys in the field.
Correct.
Whether that's correct or not, we'll find out, but I do think that is something that I'm starting to remind myself now more of these guys who, we had kind of put away in the toy box for a year, right? Now that we're getting them back out. Oh yeah. Junior Fehoko, man, he can play. Demarvion Overshown really looked good. David Durden, man, that guy could fly. It's like there are a lot of these guys who we were excited about at the time that we kind of had to put out of our mind. And now we're reopening those old toys and excited to see how they play.
One other interesting name that Wanu Thomas mentioned is Tyrus Wheat, who spent most of the 2023 season on the active roster and was active in a lot of these games. Let's talk about our expectations for him next. This episode is brought to you by FanDuel. It's winner take all time in the NBA and in the NHL, and FanDuel is giving you a shot to bring home a big win of your own. And the NBA playoffs have been absolutely fantastic. That game last night between the T-Wolves and the Nuggets was unbelievable. I never would have thought in a million years that the Timberwolves would win by 20-plus points in Denver. Absolutely insane. Go ahead and get in on the action right now as we're in round 2 of the NBA playoffs. Right now, new customers can get $150 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $150 to bet on spreads, money lines, player props, futures bets, win totals. If you want to go look at the NFL section as well, visit FanDuel.com/lockedon and make every playoff shot count with FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Welcome back to the Locked On Cowboys podcast. We are discussing the 3 most likely to be improved players heading into the 2024 season. And this last name, actually, we have 2 more names to mention, but this last one we have here is fascinating to me. Tyrus Wheat. We've mentioned him all year. Clearly, somebody liked him a lot for an undrafted free agent to make this transition from pass rusher to stand-up linebacker who played on a bunch of special teams stuff. I'm intrigued here, Landon.
Yeah, and this is one of those situations. Look, when you cover a team long enough, like you start to notice these players that like it's more about how the team is handling the player that's fascinating to you. Correct. More than anything else, right? And Tyrus Wheat to me is the guy that really fits the bill there. Because to me, it's like I see it here. Okay, look, he's got some good size. He has an interesting body type, right? He's a 6'2", 260 pound. Is he a defensive end? Is he a linebacker? I think that's kind of part of the reason that you see him fall, to where out of the draft the way he did. But I think that teams really desired it. And there was a huge bidding war for him out in undrafted free agency when it all kind of went down. The Cowboys obviously won there, and then beyond that too, like you mentioned, he was on the regular season roster, and I think a lot of that had to do with the fact that he was constantly being attempted to be poached by other teams. So, yep, I think that it has to do with the fact that he's just a really good fit for a kind of down the roster tweener linebacker, defensive end guy who can play special teams, right? Like I just think that a guy like Wheat could be an extremely valuable game day piece, right? Because he can fill so many roles for you. He can play special teams as you need. Probably plays all of them. And then like to be able to be a backup as a defensive end and a linebacker, that's a really nice piece to have on your game day roster when spots are tight and you need somebody to kind of cover a couple of different spots. I think the fact that he's on this list, that Wanye noticed him as an improved player, I think, kind of shows you the kind of work ethic there. And I think that we've heard that about him as well. Another guy who's a strong work ethic guy. I would also like to point out that I like that 2 of the 3 of these guys, and this is not a comment on Overshown's lack of this, but the 2 of the 3 of these guys are real tough guy, high motor guys, right? And not that Overshown isn't the tough guy or anything like that, but you think of an undersized linebacker, but Junior Fehoko and Tyrus Wheat, like these guys are mix it up physical players that are already being added to a roster that's looking to get more physical, right? Wheat's an SEC guy from Mississippi State who played linebacker, and he plays like that kind of guy, right? So I'm excited to see exactly what his role is going to be. I tend to think, like, if I had to guess, there's been talk about Micah Parsons potentially playing kind of more of a Sam linebacker role this year. Yep. I mean, that's, if you're just looking at body types, that fits, and skill sets, really, that really fits what Tyrus Wheat does well, right? Like, put him on the edge as a linebacker. If he needs to drop into a country drop zone, he can do that. If you need him to take down a tight end in the run game, he can do that. And I think that he could really fit in nicely as kind of a backup linebacker who could reduce down into a pass rusher as needed in certain packages.
Again, I'm going to reference like the early 2010 Bengals teams. They had a lot of these type of guys. Now, they're bigger names. Like they had James Harrison for a stretch. Manny Lawson was a former first-round pick that they kind of transitioned to an off-the-ball linebacker. I'm obviously not expecting him to be either of those guys, but it's clear they're looking for this body type of a 265-pound Sam linebacker that can basically fight your tight end in the run game, right, and kind of set that edge. We'll see. It's going to be a lot more crowded at the linebacker position this year than it was last year. Yeah, we'll see what his role is, but if he really is one of these players that's really made a leap so far in year 2, it's going to be very intriguing. I do want to mention Eric Scott. Wanye Thomas also mentioned him. He was another guy that the Cowboys actually traded up to go get. They traded future draft capital to go get Eric Scott. I'm curious to see how he fits a non-Dan Quinn defense. The Cowboys also drafted Kalen Carson on day 3 this year. So it's going to be an uphill battle for Scott, but just another interesting long defensive back trying to make the 53-man roster.
Yeah, I think Scott's, obviously a guy that, like you said, the Cowboys targeted. They liked a lot. They moved up and would have got him. I went and got him. I tend to think that just based on what we know about Will McClay, there's probably a pretty good chance they would have gone and got this guy even if Dan Quinn wasn't there, just because they have a preference for those types of corners. I also think we should mention one more name that Wanye didn't mention that I think deserves to be in this conversation, probably just knowing him, and that's Wanye Thomas. I think Wanye Thomas likely is a guy, knowing who he is, that probably improved a ton this offseason. I'm excited to see Wanye play. And obviously we've talked about the fact that we feel like the safety room is pretty well stacked, and I think he's a huge portion of that. I think, look, Donovan Wilson is going to be on this team next year. I think that's pretty clear, unless something happens.
He'll be on the team.
But I think that Wanye is a guy that could very well play himself into a starting spot for next year if he has a good season this year. And I think that there's a good chance that he's just so good that you have to play three safeties a little bit more. So I thought we should throw in Wanye's name in here as well, because he is a guy that I'm also looking forward to seeing what he has for us.
All right, that is it for today's show. We want to thank you for making Locked On Cowboys your first listen every single day. Go check out the channel on YouTube. We post videos every single day over there. On tomorrow's show, we're going to be answering your Twitter questions, so make sure you send them in to us at McCoolBCB, at Marcus_Mosier. Again, we'll see you right back here tomorrow.